think the issue is the intellectual one of selecting among the models in terms of which is a better representation of reality. Those costs depend not on the data, but rather on the economic models which apply the data. We all use the same data. There's only one set of data that's really out there, which is collected by probably the best data collection agency in the world, which is the U.S. Census Bureau. The base case is a case where the non-custodial parent has 100% of the income and the custodial parent has 100% of the parenting time. I'm going to use the base case, but I'm not going to say that should be the basis of your policy decisions. I'm focusing on that only to emphasize the economic issues as opposed to the policy. I'm aware of the issues that in making policy it needs to rely on more than merely economics. But economics is insightful, I hope, for policy decisions. And here's how I got into this. I think maybe you ought to know that. I attended a conference back many years ago, and I learned a factor which struck me as surprising, which is that child rearing cost figures, which underlay child support awards, did not, underline not, did not rest on actual expenditures. It does not measure direct spending on the child. It has imputed values which follow from the models which are employed. That quote emphasizes the critical importance of the models which are employed. Because the existing child support award figures do not rest on actual expenditures. And your own report says that, and it's absolutely true. Working with U.S. Census data, while it's all there, it's not so easy. You know, it's not so easy to take the right variables from that disk and program it correctly and do the analysis. You know, gathering the data from the U.S. Census and then putting 4 years worth of data all together and merging them. I mean, that's a 5-year enterprise, and that's why it took us so long. Then you can see the quote from the federal regulations. The whole purpose of this enterprise, so the federal regulations say, is to divide fairly the burdens of child rearing, the economic burdens of child rearing. And that's really what my presentation deals with. Not the division, but rather, what are those burdens? How do you measure the economic burdens of child rearing? That's from their quote. How do you measure the economic burdens of child rearing? What variables do you gather? The variables that fit your model. And so you form the model, and then you say, what variables can we get to work with our model, work in the confines of our model? So we don't choose a variable willy-nilly. We choose a variable to fit with the model which is pre-selected. And that's probably one part of the reason why we get different results. It's because different variables are needed for different models. But the way to think of it, I believe, is to think about which model you want. So therefore, the selection of the model matters, doesn't it? That's where it's at. Okay, now if you go to the data, but even apart from the data, the reality is that certain expenditures are made specifically for children. Right? We all know that. Right? However, what about these other categories? how should they be divided? And it turns out that the issue of how to divide those expenditures is the source of all the issues involved. That factor is the source of all. And the three models divide these expenditures in three different ways. How do you specify particular items in these categories? And I didn't do it. The Census Bureau did. How do we derive expenditures for children from household expenditures in the areas of household collective goods? Right? And the answer to an economist is pretty straightforward. If we had two households, one with children and one without children, and the households were identical, that's a big if, then we could ask how much more is spent with the child than without the child, right? And we could compare them, and that difference would be the expenditures on children. If the household in economics, cost is defined by marginal costs, the additional costs or incremental costs associated with particular activity. And that's the definition I tell my students, and it's a definition I try to apply here. And if we had two identical households and they made different decisions with and without children, and the decisions made with children were due to the presence of children, everything else would be the same, then we could look at the additional expenditures associated with children. If we had two identical families, one with children, one without, then we could derive in each category the expenditures on children from the differences between them. Monetary costs and economic costs are not the same, because there's an opportunity cost of most things, right? Opportunity costs are real economic costs, even if they're not monetary costs. And opportunity costs can exist, as my slide says, even in the absence of expenditures, even in the absence of monetary. Now, let's think about opportunity costs, because that's where it lies. The most important opportunity cost is clearly the time spent by the parents in raising their children. We and everybody else ignore that cost. We ignore it. Because parents are so different. We don't know how to deal with that. So I want to acknowledge that is probably the most important opportunity cost around, but we ignore it. And if the task force has a way to deal with that on a policy basis, that'd be great, but there's no economics that I could offer here. None. However, there is a second opportunity cost we should deal with, and that is where you guys have to be involved. There's no monetary cost because your rents and everything is the same. In my data, you get zero cost. It's true, because there's no money. It measures household expenditures, and you do not get additional household expenditures. And so that's the way the Census Bureau does it. That is the devil in the detail. And the issue then is, how do we measure these opportunity costs, because they don't show up in the census data? The real distinction between the three models is how we measure these opportunity costs. They're different because they measure opportunity costs differently. That is the profound difference between the three models. So the question is, how do we measure these opportunity costs, and what do we do about it? And my answer is, we don't do a very good job at it. That's a quote from the journalist, that there's no monetary costs, right? I like that quote because it is truth. there's a lot of people like that. There's a lot of people that spend more money on housing too, but there's a lot of people like that too. As I said before, the two other models, besides my own, is how to evaluate the opportunity costs. And the two models are the USDA model and the income equivalence models. The Rothbard and Engels are just variations on the income equivalence models. Both are designed to estimate these imputed costs, right? Opportunity costs are not monetary costs, they're imputed costs, right? So they're designed to measure these opportunity costs, and we impute them. Dividing the monetary cost by 3, as the USDA did pre-2009, was just an imputed cost. It wasn't an actual cost. You really have to get that. The USDA imputes children's housing costs as the hypothetical additional rental charge associated with moving from a 2-bedroom to a 3-bedroom apartment. That's what they said. The USDA, you see the quote. They say the USDA report, this is from the California report, they say the USDA report approach is direct, but it relies on assumptions that are designed to be wrong. And I've got it here if you guys want to see it. Now, what are the assumptions? That people buy a second bed, third bedroom, an extra bedroom for a child. It's designed to be wrong. You know that doesn't happen. His numbers are more, 3.5 times mine. 3.5 times mine for the same income level. You have to ask yourselves whether that's reasonable. This is the third point. Where the USDA report says that one could measure housing costs the way I suggested we should do it, by looking at the housing expenses for the same family as children are added to the household. Right? That is what I proposed. And he says that these could be calculated by utilizing these additional costs. But then he rejects it because he says that you can't possibly determine comparable households with and without children. And I think that is just wrong. Because statistically, I have a large sample of thousands of households with and without children of the same income and in the same part of the country and the same urban-rural divide. And I can compare averages. I don't need to deal with precise averages for the same income in the same section of the country. Now, I wish I had better data, but that's the data I have and I have to use it. All right, let's go on to food costs. What the USDA does with food costs is striking. It deals with the cost of a nutritious diet, if you look at there. And it's in the U.S. Department of Agriculture, so they have to deal with a nutritious diet. Right? Whether or not parents actually do nutritious diets, right? So then they take it as a percentage, and then once they get a nutritious diet and they relate it to income, then they divide it equally. If they get that, look at the difference in our numbers. My incremental numbers are $471. His incremental numbers, his numbers based on this average value is over $2,000. Enormous differences. And that's the difference. In the food area, it's not so much opportunity cost, although it's a little bit in terms of what you said. It is the difference between a nutritious diet and what is done. Look at the differences at the last. This is again for low-income married households. Their number is $1,400 and mine is $300. It's not the way people behave. The assumptions that are made do not reflect actual expenditures. No, it's different. Why aren't they so different? Just a minute, why aren't they so different? Because this is not a collective good. Without children, you spend zero, essentially. on these issues. And I'm surprised they're as different as they are, maybe because of different years. But I would have expected we'd got almost the same numbers. Right? And we got almost the same numbers. So, where the USDA gives you what I think are excessive numbers are where they deal with household collective goods, food, and housing, and transportation. And so what you want to see is compare our numbers, which are the incremental costs of having one child, or 2 children, or 3 children, with USDA costs, and then imputed cost is the difference. What I mean by imputed costs is how much should be allocated to child costs as the value of opportunity costs. So how do we get that? We take the USDA numbers and we minus the monetary numbers, that's what we found, and we got the imputed costs. So the third column is the second column minus the first column. The numbers, I think, are striking because the imputed costs exceed the incremental costs. The largest share of the USDA values are their effort to estimate opportunity costs, or imputed costs, right? Not actual. Second, note the difference between housing and child care. In every case, the USDA has housing costs as the biggest category. In every case, we don't. We have child care and education as the biggest category. Our numbers suggest that the largest category of child costs is child care and education. The USDA numbers say the largest category of child costs are housing costs. You guys have to make that decision between them. It's not just the effort to estimate opportunity costs, it's what numbers you get from the decisions that they made. And the decisions that they made gave enormous amounts of opportunity costs. Enormous. I mean, the numbers are what the numbers are. 3 children for a household of average of $36,000. They with 3 children, the total costs are $17,000. What's that? Half? 17,000 divided by 36,000 is something like half. Do you think that's the way people in fact behave? And even the imputed costs are so enormous. When you make your decisions, I would ask you to consider these numbers. Medium income. Medium income is income between $55,000 and $101,000. Right? And the average for household income is $76,000 in this sample. This is the middle third. And you can see what the numbers look like using exactly the same methodologies. Once again, housing costs are the highest for the USDA numbers, and once again, the child care and education is the highest category for our numbers. The incremental costs. With 3 kids, it's $16,000 versus $7,000. This is a system which blows up the final results based on imputed costs, because that's their model. The next one is high income. High income are all households with income above $101,000, and the average is $168,000. And you can see what the numbers are. Now these are families with an average of income of $160,000. All right, and so these are the data on how much incrementally they spend on their children. And You can see the numbers. Right? They are what they are. And they're not zero, but they're not, they are what they are. I don't know what else to say. This is the U.S., this is the data that we get from high-income married households. You can see with 3 children they spend on the average of $7,000 on child care and education, but not 10,000. The USDA, not 10,000. Right? And the housing is much less because they would probably have the same house with or without children. Right? Maybe they have a big house, and now they still have the big house, but they use it more for bedrooms. The USDA estimates really rest on arbitrary presumptions on how expenditures are made, and they do that with the legitimate purpose of trying to impute the full opportunity costs. Let's go to the next one. All right, I want to go beyond the USDA to talk about income equivalence models. Now I know that's not the basis of child support awards in Minnesota, but it is the model which is used mainly in other states. And so I want to talk a little bit about that, but I won't spend too much time. All right? The income equivalence models, which most states use, have 2 varieties, and you can see what they say. Engel's models are defined a certain way, and Rothbarth models in a different way. Let's apply the income equivalence approach to my den nursery example, because it keeps it manageable. Both forms estimate the dollar amount that should be compensated to the household to compensate the adults for their loss of the den. But note, and here's a critical factor, the budget constraint of the household is not considered. So these compensation amounts may exceed the budget of the household. But these are not considered. They don't, when you do this modeling, you ignore the budget constraint. And that's one of the major defects of it. Let's go to the next slide. Let me go to that California report, which I mentioned before. And please read the first quote on there. And you can see it's a reference to the California report. Had the parents been childless, they would have been better off, because they wouldn't have to share their collective goods, food, housing, transportation with their kids. You're better off when you don't share with your kids. That's the essence of this method. The essence of this method is that you're worse off when you share your common goods with your kids, and you're better off without them. That's the essence of this method. The second critical premise is that the required compensation depends on adult clothing. The Rothbarth method says that the only way we can equate welfare in a family is when they spend the same amount on adult children, on adult clothing. Right? Even though adult clothing is generally less than 5% of household spending. So we're using as our index of welfare a very relatively minor level item in the household budget. And the California report acknowledged that this is questionable as a measure of household standards. But probably the most important assumption, which is based on pure economics, is the fact that we assume that the preferences of the adults are the same with or without children. And we all know that our lives change when children come into it. We all know that. And our preferences change. We all know that. Anybody who's had kids knows that. Right? And that's not permitted in the income equivalence methods. Income equivalence methods logically require that preferences don't change in the presence of children than they were without children. And there's an enormous economic literature that says that assumption is simply wrong. Simply wrong. And I can give you, in my paper, we have a lot of references to that economic literature. I'm not going to repeat that for you here. It'd probably send you to sleep. But we all know that preferences change in the presence of children, and that's not permitted by income equivalence methods. Let's go on to the next one. All right, so let's look at the numbers. You can see the one thing about income equivalence methods is that they are not item specific. They're not category specific. They are only done with overall, because that's the way they're computed. Because their whole focus is on how much do we have to provide a household to increase the level of adult clothing to what it was in the absence of children. The issue is, how much income do we have to give a household in the presence of children to make them spend as much money as they spent without children? Without children. It's true that when children arrive, most households spend less money on adult clothing. But how much less? And it says that we have to spend enough to equalize the amount of adult clothing, and that amount of income equals the cost of raising children. The cost of raising children is defined in the Rothbarth method as the amount of compensation that must be given to the adults in the household to have them spend as much money on adult clothing as they spent without children. That's just what it is. And you can see the numbers. Once again, we get imputed costs, which are equal, or for most cases, equal or exceeding incremental costs. So that's not true in high-income households. There's a real difference between by income levels. But the imputed costs are really, again, very high. The Rothbarth method is another way of deriving imputed costs, which once again exceed real expenditures. Now, the other one was 3419, this is 3421, but it's the
Okay.
same number. Okay. Now, it's rounding error, somehow it got that. Now, Rothbard doesn't do it this way. They don't look at category by category expenditures. They don't look at expenditures at all, except adult clothing. They don't look at any good which children are involved in. They only look at adult clothing, which in principle has nothing to do with children. And they ask, how much did adult clothing decline when children arrive? And you can determine that by differences in number of children. And then they ask, how much money do I have to give this household to bring their adult clothing expenditures up to what it was originally, or originally without children?
And so the $3,083 on that first line is how much they have to give this household to get the expenditures
No,
up?
no, it's the $6,000 number.
It's the $6,000 to get it up there.
To get the adult clothing up, and then I subtracted 6,000 from 3,000 to get the third column, to get the, in some sense, the imputed costs. But there's no issue about the 3,421.
Okay,
That's
Thank
does that make sense?
yeah, I wasn't catching that in relation to this, looking at a very, I think probably low expense of the adult clothing and how they extrapolated out to get to the 6,504. That's the piece I was missing.
It's a very complicated method, not one that I would ever use.
Okay.
Break, I'll look for it.
Thank you, sir.
And so I cannot accept I think the economics of the income equivalence models, in both its varieties, are based on unacceptably stringent assumptions. The USDA models at least make an attempt to look at the data, but they're based on inappropriate assumptions too. They're based on some sort of ideal circumstances as opposed to actual circumstances. The second bedroom issue and the nutritious diet issue and the dividing transportation costs on a per capita basis. So I think that's preferable as an approach, but not the way it's done.
Thank you.
Okay, let's, we're moving right along. Let's go to the next slide. Remember, economic costs include imputed costs. And there are two relevant questions which I would have you consider. First is whether imputed costs should be part of child support awards. Yes, some level of imputed costs should be included with full economic costs. But is that what child support awards are designed to compensate? That's a policy question for you to decide, not for me. That's my second thing. Whether child support payments should cover opportunity costs as opposed to be limited to monetary costs. Because remember, opportunity costs are not out-of-pocket costs. It's the cost of the den. Should child support awards compensate the custodial parent for the loss of the den? That's a policy issue, not an economic issue. And the second is, how do we measure these imputed costs? And I think it can only be done by making strong and basically arbitrary assumptions. The real issue is we don't know how to measure these imputed costs accurately. And we just don't know how to measure it. We can only do so by making arbitrary assumptions. The arbitrary assumption in income equivalence, the primary one, is that utility functions or preferences don't change in the presence of children, even though we all know they do. The primary arbitrary assumption in the USDA numbers is that in the presence of a child, the household necessarily goes out and gets a second bedroom, a separate bedroom. It's not the way people behave. Both assumptions are arbitrary and lead to the results that are obtained. My approach is also incorrect because I say I don't know how to measure these opportunity costs, so I'll forget about them. Right? That's also wrong. I don't want to tell you it's not. So the issue is, which poison do you take? And I think it depends on the numbers. If you said that my results are too small because they ignore opportunity costs, I would agree with that. But I don't think they rise to the level that I report. And how to make that judgment, I don't know. What do you think about that? You know, about the three models. Now we've gotten to the three models. That's right. What I've given you is a floor.
Yeah.
And I'm not saying that the floor doesn't have to include these opportunity costs. But the way it's done now is excessive. I think that's my bottom line. And it's tough, I think, for people to disagree with, at least as a matter of economics, not as a matter of policy. To the extent that child support awards exceed the true opportunity cost of raising children, the economic costs, including the opportunity cost, it creates an asset to have the child. Well, let me handle that a little bit later, right? Because there are opportunity costs, and we don't know how to measure them. And I can imagine my numbers being increased by some reasonable percentage. I'm not going to mention the number,
Yeah.
but not to the percentages that I observe. So I guess that's my general opinion.
Makes
And
sense.
we know it's excessive because of a little bit of what, let me show you one other number.
Yeah.
All right, first, let's go to the next one. First of all, we went to this base case and we found child support guidelines numbers, and they are what they are. As you can see, you can look at the support guidelines, you can look at my incremental numbers, and you can look at the US FDA numbers, right? Your numbers are less than the USDA estimates, but they're substantially higher than my own. I mean, unless we made some mistakes, that's what we found on the website. So maybe that's the ballpark in which you're working. Right? Any questions about that? I mean, these are I'm just repeating the numbers I had before.
There was a hand in the audience earlier, sir. Do you still have a quick question?
It's gone out.
Okay, thank you.
All right, let's go on. Let's go to the next one. All right. And let me get back to Jimmy's question. What are the implications of awards which exceed the direct cost of raising children? And you can see when awards are greater than child custody, child parenting becomes a financial asset. It's just the way it is. And then the award structure provides a monetary incentive to gain maximum parenting time, even apart from everything else. Because the custodial parent benefits from the extent to which the award exceeds the costs. And it creates resentment in the obligor whose payments fund this asset. And and then I have a chart from the most recent federal report. Let's go on to the next one. That's just a Xerox of the federal report from Minnesota. And you can see that the report provides collecting regular on-time payments is somewhere in the low 70%, under 3/4. And I ask you whether that's related to the level of awards. That's a question, not an answer. Whether or not this number, which seems low to me, is in some sense related to the fact that award levels may exceed the cost of raising children, including opportunity costs. Someone asked whether or not income affects expenditures on children. And the answer is, of course it does. Wealthier families spend more on their children than less wealthy families. And we know that, and it shows up in the numbers. And the reason why we did our analysis separately by income class is to emphasize the role of income. What did we do? We divided our sample of married households into 3/3, low, medium, and high income levels. And we included income even within each category. So income is there twice. And we divided the samples because there's a different set of preferences for higher income levels than lower income levels. It may very well be that the extra bedroom approach is more reasonable for high income levels than it is for low income levels. I can accept that. So income plays a major part in the analysis that we did. And by ethnicities, but your data becomes then too small and you don't have as much confidence in the results. You have much more confidence in the results obtained when you have larger sample size. And so the one thing we did was break it down by income classes, and I think that's important. And while I would love to do it, to break things down more finely, I'm not sure I'm able to. The one thing I could do, perhaps, is right now our analysis is based on 4 years of surveys. Rather than, we could maybe do it with 6 years and add the number of years and then adjust it in terms of price levels. And then maybe we could get more finely derived data. There is things to do if we do it over time. We had to do a break off it as it is. We stopped at 4 years, but maybe it would be different if we had 6 or even more, because that would keep the sample size up if we looked at more finely selected subgroups. This analysis is not the final word. It's the first word, at least from me. It could and should be extended. I don't think that the results I've given you are the final word, and I don't want you to think that I believe so. But it's the first effort at estimating monetary costs and not using these other two methods which are so dependent on measuring opportunity costs. So let's turn to table 10. Table 10. And we're comparing myself, the USDA, and Center for Policy Research, which is the income equivalence methods, okay? And the numbers are, we already did the numbers on the top 3, right? The married households. So let's compare them with the numbers with single households. And you can see that and the only thing to really compare is low income, because we had enough sample size to compare low income married and low income single. With single, medium, high, we didn't have enough sample size, so we combined them. You can see that middle high for single covers the groups between middle and high for married. You all see that? Okay, so let's look at single households, which is the best comparison. All right, and you can see that with one child, single households spend more, slightly more. And with, in terms of my own numbers, and with the USDA numbers, they spend slightly less. But the numbers are not very large. Again, with 2 children, my numbers went up and USDA numbers went down, but not all that much. And the same thing applies to 3+ children. So you get some differences, but not a lot. They're both minor. Now, again, this is not comparing. This is not comparing the non-custodial parent. This is just looking at the custodial parent. We had households with children. This is single parent households as compared with married parent households. And so all we're looking at is how does single parent households make expenditures on children as contrasted with married households with the same income level. Please emphasize, this is the same income level. This is at the average income. And the average incomes are living there. All right? Well, you can see that the numbers aren't very different, although the average income has declined substantially. So the percentage you spend on children has gone up. The average income in a married household is $36,000, and the average income for a single household is $27,000.
In the low category.
In the low category, yes. In the middle high, before we had 76,000 and 168,000, and here we have a middle high together of 94, which is somewhere in the middle, which is what you'd expect. The numbers for single households are somewhere in between middle and high for married households. Again, as you would expect. That's because of the sample size problem. So what do I conclude from this? That expenditures on children, which are my estimate of the cost of raising a child, are not widely different between a married household and a single household. That's what the numbers seem to suggest. That doesn't mean that the non-custodial parent doesn't have additional expenses. But I didn't deal with that. I only dealt with the cost of raising a child, including the custodial parent in the single category. Now, in terms of the financial asset, to the extent that on separation, the support awards exceed the costs of raising the child, including the opportunity costs, appropriately measured, then there's a surplus to the recipient and there's a deficit to the payer. And that's all I mean by the concept of financial asset. There's a surplus. That just follows from arithmetic. And it's a deficit for the payer. So as a result it creates tension. Because the payer knows this. And the recipient knows this too. And it creates conflict. How could it not? And so my question to you and to the task force is, if we can get award amounts to be as close as we can possibly arrange at, to represent the true costs, including the opportunity costs, then neither side has a financial problem. I don't want to diminish your concept, because I'm not. But I'm diminishing the way it's done. That's my. Alright, we through? No. So I got one more slide, go to the end. I have to have a judgment, right? I can have a judgment. And that, however you measure opportunity cost, the outcome of an effective child support payment system is enhanced when support obligations reflect the correct measure of child costs and is reduced in effectiveness when it does not. But that's a policy judgment, not an economics judgment. But I'd like to end with that, so thank you very much.